Lately, we've been experiencing crazy inflation. Housing costs are soaring. Food prices are constantly on the rise. Gasoline prices have been rising for years, but in return, wages have stagnated. In reality, there's a reason for all this, which can be explained by going back to 1971, the year Coco Chanel died, the year our third rocket landed on the moon, the year Bangladesh gained independence, and 1971 saw the suspension of the Bretton Woods Agreement. It was with this suspended agreement that everything changed. Before the suspension of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the United States had experienced a rapid period of growth. In those days, wages made it easy to pay for a house, feed an entire family on a single salary, and pay for school without stress. More importantly, it allowed people to save for their retirement. Today, for the younger generation, this is just pure fantasy. It's difficult to put money aside, let alone prepare for retirement, as we saw in the previous video on pensions. So why was 1971 such a pivotal year? And what did the Bretton Woods Agreement change? To give you some context, Ben Prentice and Colin aka HAC have created a website, WTFHappenedIn1971.com, which provides a chart of what has happened since 1971. We can see that after 1971, many things changed, notably the distribution of wealth. Before 1971, everyone got richer at more or less the same rate. Then after 1971, the rich got richer, and the middle and working classes stagnated. We also see a graph of the growth of productivity and hourly earnings. In yellow, you can see the American productivity curve, and in red, the hourly wage, perfectly aligned before 1971. The curves diverge afterward, meaning that productivity gains no longer reach workers' pockets. There's also a graph on inflation, which exploded after 1971, a graph on tuition costs, or another on the Consumer Price Index. In these different graphs, we can see that trends reverse from 1971 onwards. In 1971, we changed the way society worked without anyone realizing it. To understand what happened, we need to go back to the years before the First World War, when trade around the world was based on the gold standard, a monetary system in which the value of currency is indexed to gold. It was a system that worked well, and governments got along pretty well, until the outbreak of the First World War. During World War I, Britain, Germany, and other major economies suspended the gold standard in order to print enough money to manage the immense amounts of capital needed for war financing. This led to periods of serious inflation in these economies. Commodity price levels reached their all-time high and even rose by more than 150% in some of these nations. At the end of World War I, the Americans had a gold deficit, and this did not improve with the Great Depression of 1929. In the grip of the Great Depression, most of the major European economies, such as Britain and its colonies, Germany, Austria, and other European countries, abandoned the gold standard permanently due to their deep economic problems. Around March 1933, there were massive bank failures in the United States, owing to the large magnitude of bank runs by the public, increasing the supply of money in the economy by printing more paper money. Without affecting the gold standard and interest rates was not possible. Considering it would reduce gold reserves and depreciate the value of dollars further. As a consequence, the United States passed the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, nationalizing all gold held by private individuals and institutions, including the Federal Reserve Bank. President Roosevelt forbade hoarding of gold coins, bullion, and gold certificates in the states. He even banned the export of gold. This move devalued the dollar against gold from $20.67 to troy ounce to $35 to troy ounce. The U.S. was still on the gold standard, and the devaluation of the dollar gave more power to the U.S. government over the money supply. Then World War II came around. America was again dipping into its gold reserves to finance this new war, except that it would be far more expensive than the First World War. This war destroyed the world's financial system, so we had to come up with a new one. By the end of the war, the United States had emerged as the world's undisputed power. To finance itself, the taxes in gold possessed by the United States were no longer enough. So with their status as the hegemonic power, the Americans, along with 43 other nations, set up the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. An agreement in which the dollar remained fixed to gold at $35 an ounce. While the currencies of the participating countries, including Great Britain, France, Germany, and others, agreed to a fixed adjustable exchange rate against the dollar. While these countries kept gold reserves, they preferred to settle international balances in dollars, which were rarely converted into gold. As you know, with great power comes great responsibility. The overpowerful American empire could print as much money as it wanted for any reason it wanted. Those who thought the Americans would rigorously follow protocols to keep the number of dollars in circulation equal to the amount of gold at their disposal, and that they wouldn't take advantage of the situation, were simply delusional. Whether it was for an American politician to stay in power with generous social programs or major infrastructure development programs, the Americans never bothered to print everything they needed, even more so in 1955, when America went to war against Vietnam. The war in Vietnam lasted 20 years and cost $168 billion, or $1 trillion today. A sizable increase in domestic spending on President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs and a rise in military spending caused by the Vietnam War gradually worsened the overvaluation of the dollar. Fearing that they would have to pay more per ounce of gold due to the catastrophic management by the US of the system, countries like France and the UK decided to leave the Bretton Woods system while they still had time, anticipating an increase in the price of gold from their $35 per ounce to much more to refinance America's spending spree. The situation was such that France sent a warship to New York in early August 1971 to take back its gold. A few days later, on August 15, 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon announced the temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility to gold. The Nixon shock, as the unilateral suspension of Bretton Woods is often called, brought about an unprecedented shift in economies and societies around the world, because from then on, all national currencies ceased to have an anchor point. For the first time in history, if you wanted people to work for you, if you wanted to take money from your citizens, if you wanted your citizens to remain slaves to their jobs, you no longer needed to force it on them, because the introduction of fiat currency gave greater control and flexibility to central banks to adjust the money supply in the economy. What this means in reality is that all you had to do was print more money, as this will lower the currency's value without anyone noticing. The amount of people's wealth remains numerically the same, but the fact that there's more money in circulation lowers the value of their money. The insane money printing policy that followed in the US drove up real estate and stock prices, enriching the richest and making life harder for the rest of the population from 1971 onwards, as the graph shows. 1971 was also the year the 30-year mortgage was introduced. Where it once took 3 years to pay off a house, now it will take 30 years, or 10 times as long. All because the Federal Reserve's printing plant is firing on all cylinders. This means that wage earners will remain docile to their employees for fear of being unable to pay their debts. The founder of WTF Happened in 1971.com website, Ben Prentice, has this to say about rising inequality. The greatest driver of inequality today is financial asset inflation, which is a direct result of monetary expansion. When you increase the money supply, you're going to increase the cost of hard-supplied assets like stocks, for example. When we look at the graphs on their website, we can see that the average sales price of houses sold in the U.S. for the federal minimum hourly wage in the U.S. skyrocketed after 1971, as shown in this graph. With the cost of living skyrocketing after 1971, most Americans became slaves. It became more and more difficult to live with exorbitant prices and the printing machines that discreetly lowered the wealth of Americans without them realizing it. Over time, more and more Americans were going to live from paycheck to paycheck. Today, the nightmare continues, with more and more young Americans living with their parents. Because of the COVID crisis, the Federal Reserve has decided to print insane amounts since January 2020. Approximately the equivalent of 80% of all US dollars in existence have been printed since 2020 alone. By the way, when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act to give African Americans more rights and financial support in 1964, the result of this policy was very surprising, as it didn't work at all. The average wage of African Americans as a percentage of average whites was rising before 1971, but since then it's been stagnant. But the reason behind it is a terrible CIA plot that has ruined the African American community forever. You can learn more and find out what the CIA has done to African Americans by watching the video I made about it.